All right, hello. Today we're talking about the slave trade. You would have hopefully studied this in Year 8 at Cedarmount Academy, and you don't need to know everything as in as much depth as we taught about it to you in Year 8, but all of that will still be useful to you. See, you guys need to know how the slave trade worked, but in particular you need to know how it affected Britain in particular. Because the thing is, the main way that this Atlantic slave trade operated was through a method called triangle trade. You can see an image of it on the bottom left-hand side. Essentially, the process worked like this. You would be in Britain, a slave trader. You would own a ship. You would buy some products in Britain with some money that you had, let's say. So you'd make a loss. You'd, well, buy some stuff. It might be guns. It might be even tobacco. It might be glass. A variety of things that might be useful. You'd sail them down to Africa and you would trade those items to various people in Africa, including slave capturers or kidnappers, people that would actively, their job was to kidnap African people, or even, should we say, local African tribes that had captured people solely to be traded off to the Atlantic slave trade. Then you would take these people onto your ship in a process like you can see above, across the Atlantic Ocean. The conditions on these ships were horrible. If you were in the lesson, you'll have seen a video that relates to the, should we say, intensity of these trips, but essentially these people were not treated like human beings. They were treated like cattle, and they were treated as less than human. Once they arrived in the USA, these people would then be traded again to plantation owners making cotton, tobacco and sugar for that cotton, tobacco and sugar. Those people would then spend the rest of their lives growing those crops in America under horrific conditions and some of the worst conditions known to history. And then that cotton, sugar, tobacco would be taken by the slave trader back to Britain, where they would sell it off for a profit. They would earn more money than they had at the start, and then they'd begin the process again. They'd buy more stuff, they'd go to Africa, they'd trade it off, they'd take people, they'd move it to the USA, give it to the plantation owners, take their stuff, come back. It was a never-ending cycle of earning money. Those slave traders had no reason to stop. It was not illegal what they were doing, it was fully legal, and it earned you loads of money. Those people sacrificed lives, they killed people, they treated people as subhuman purely because they earned loads of money off of it. And the thing is, we need to talk about how that changed Britain, because Britain was not the only country that had slave traders. Loads of European countries engaged in the slave trade, but Britain had some of the biggest profits. I believe Britain earned around £60 million in the space of about 40 years over the slave trade. And the thing is, that does change how the makeup of Britain looks. Port cities that have, next to the sea, Glasgow, Liverpool, Bristol, all increased in the amount of money they had because all of that stuff, cotton, sugar, tobacco, was arriving in their ports and they could sell it on and earn loads of money again. This meant these cities became quite rich. If you've ever been to Liverpool, I've got a picture at the top left there, those buildings, that docks in Liverpool is a really beautiful area. And the thing is, it was all paid with money earned from the slave trade. In fact, there were loads of people in Britain that kind of technically worked in the slave trade. People who built ships, people who made guns, people who worked in banks, people who invested in stuff, people who imported stuff, dock workers. People in Britain who didn't even engage with slaves or enslaved people still made money from the slave trade. In fact, Manchester was called Cottonopolis because it processed all of the cotton that arrived from the slave trade. And that actually made most of Manchester city centre. Manchester itself is, should we say, supported by the trade of human life. Now, that did have some changes to how Britain worked as well, not just on a money level or a building level, but on a mental level as well. Because the idea that, should we say, Britain was earning so much money and it wasn't illegal to treat, should we say, African people this way, it created the mindset that European or white people were superior to African people. The idea that what you'd watch these enslaved people working for someone else would put that kind of, or implant that idea in your head that, they always work for somebody else. And it created a bit of a mindset in the British populace that they were better than everybody else, and specifically better than people of colour. In fact, it got to some dramatic points. I'm going to skim a lot, but essentially when slavery was abolished in the early 1800s in the UK, British people paid the ones who were going to lose the most money from this. So those bankers and, should we say, importers and slave traders who now didn't have a job because the slave trade was banned, They got compensation. They got like 25 grand because they'd lost their job. They got a payout from the slave trade ending when they'd done the horrific things in the slave trade. It's not a pretty past of Britain at this point. It's not a pretty thing to think about. But you need to know the key points of this. So using the textbook and even this video, can you answer these questions for us? How did the trade of enslaved people work? What was the economic impact on Britain? And what was the social impact on Britain? Read it through, write it down, revise it. Good luck.